The town calls him the Butcher of Blavican. They mean it as an insult, but Geralt doesn't correct them, because if you watch what actually happens in that square, you don't see a man who lost control. You see a man who had already decided before anyone else in that square understood what was coming. No anguish, no hesitation. Just a calculation he's done 100 times before in situations where all the answers were bad. That's not brutality. That's something far more psychologically interesting. A man who has deliberately trained himself not to need to be understood. Geralt's famous code, the Lesser Evil, is usually described as a philosophy. It's more accurate to call it a coping mechanism. When faced with a choice between two bad outcomes, you choose the one that causes less damage, and then you carry that. You don't rationalize it away. You don't pretend you saved the day. You picked the thing that hurt fewer people, and now you live with it. Psychologists call this a form of moral pragmatism, decision-making that prioritizes outcomes over principles when principles would lead to paralysis. And it sounds reasonable enough, stated like that. But moral pragmatism, applied consistently across a lifetime of terrible choices, does something to a person. It creates what's sometimes called moral residue, a cumulative weight of lesser decisions that never fully resolves. Each one was the right call. Each one still cost something. Geralt carries decades of this. The Blavican massacre, the decisions around Ciri, the choices he makes in every Witcher contract, where the real monster turns out to be the client, and his response, the thing that looks like coldness, is actually a form of psychological insulation. He's not detached because he doesn't care. He's detached because a person who fully felt every lesser evil they ever chose would not be functional. That's the foundation. And it leads somewhere more uncomfortable, because the detachment doesn't just happen on its own. It gets built, deliberately and early. Witcher training does something specific to its subjects, and Sapkowski is careful about this. It doesn't eliminate emotion. It trains it down to a manageable frequency. The trial of the grasses, the mutations, the years of brutal conditioning, these don't produce psychopaths. They produce people who have learned that emotional engagement with outcomes leads to worse outcomes. That if you start to care about whether the person you're protecting is worthy of protection, you hesitate, and hesitation in Geralt's world gets people killed. This is a real psychological process. Learned emotional suppression, the deliberate dampening of effective responses, appears in populations who face repeated high-stakes trauma, where emotion functionally interferes with survival. Combat veterans, first responders, surgeons. What makes Geralt interesting is that the suppression is incomplete, and he knows it. He takes contracts for individuals that pay poorly or nothing. He makes choices that protect people he explicitly says he doesn't care about. He raises Ciri as a daughter while insisting for years that he has no stake in her survival. The detachment is a performance he gives to the world and, increasingly, to himself. But the behavior underneath it tells a different story. Psychologists studying emotional suppression in high-functioning individuals note a consistent pattern. The suppression is most intense in people who feel things most acutely. The wall doesn't get built by people who don't care. It gets built by people who care too much and have learned that showing it makes them a target for manipulation, for grief, for the kind of loss that stops you from functioning. Geralt has lost too many things to count. Every loss confirmed the hypothesis, and so the detachment deepened. But the suppression doesn't eliminate the feeling. It defers it. And over a lifetime, deferred feeling accumulates somewhere. It has to go somewhere, which shapes the third pillar directly. Because the detachment doesn't only affect what Geralt feels, it shapes what he's willing to belong to. Geralt's neutrality, his refusal to take sides in human wars, political conflicts, power struggles, is usually framed as wisdom. And it is, partly. But it's also something else. It's identity formation around exclusion. Geralt belongs to no nation. He serves no king. He holds no political allegiance. He is, structurally, an outsider everywhere he goes. And at a certain point, a person in that position has two options: grieve the exclusion or reframe it as a choice. Geralt chose the latter. Psychological reactance is the tendency to assert autonomy in direct proportion to how much it's been threatened. Geralt was told, in effect, that he doesn't belong to human society. His response was to decide he doesn't want to. What started as exclusion became, over decades, a position he actively defends. That's not wisdom, or not only wisdom, it's also a man protecting himself from a rejection he experienced before he could fully understand it. And the strategy works. Geralt moves through the world with unusual freedom precisely because he has no loyalties to be leveraged. No side can threaten him with belonging, because he's already surrendered belonging. But the cost of that strategy is that it makes intimacy structurally difficult. The only relationships that work for Geralt are the ones where the other person refuses to let his performance of detachment be the final word. Dandelion, famously, simply doesn't accept it. Yennefer sees through it and matches it. Ciri breaks it. 3 people who got through the wall. And each of them did it differently. That pattern matters, and it connects directly to why this character resonates far outside the audience you'd expect. The people drawn to this character recognize something in him that they can't always name. The combination of high function and emotional reservation. The gap between what they feel and what they show. The exhaustion of making pragmatic choices in a world that rewards idealism in theory and punishes it in practice. Geralt works as a character because he's legible. The psychology underneath the Stoicism isn't mysterious once you look at it directly. It follows from the conditions, the training, the losses, the centuries of being treated as something between a tool and a threat. The behavior makes sense. And when something makes sense, people recognize it. There's a psychological term, alexithymia, for difficulty identifying and articulating emotional states. It exists on a spectrum, and in subclinical ranges, it's extremely common among people in high-stress, high-responsibility positions. People who learned, one way or another, that the expression of need or vulnerability was a liability. Geralt is a competence fantasy with a psychological price tag attached, and the price tag is what makes him feel real. He is what happens when a person is extremely good at surviving and only intermittently good at living. That specific combination, functional, guarded, quietly aching, is not a niche experience. It's one of the more common human configurations that almost no one talks about, because the people who experience it are precisely the ones trained not to. Sapkowski built a character who made that visible, and then the games, at their best, gave that character choices with real moral weight, real consequences, real moments where the wall comes down, not because Geralt decided to open up, but because the situation left him no remaining defense. The lesser evil was never a philosophy. It was a survival strategy. And the thing about survival strategies is that they work until they don't, until the thing you were surviving toward turns out to be something you actually want. And you've spent so long pretending you don't want anything that you're not sure how to reach for it anymore. That's the arc. A man who built a wall to protect something he claimed not to have and spent 30 years being slowly, stubbornly loved back into admitting it was there. The butcher of Blavican made the right call. He'll never say so. The town will never believe it. And somewhere in that gap between what was necessary and what will never be acknowledged is where Geralt of Rivia has lived his entire life. Subscribe if you want more of this. I'll see you in the next one.